What was your trading style at this time?
I'm trading every month in soybeans. I'm taking delivery of soybeans. I'm trading soybeans on the last day before expiration. One day I bought it limit down and I sold it limit up because everybody was afraid to take delivery. And when the bell rang at noon, if you weren't out, you took delivery. So I figured out how to set up the banking lines and to take delivery. It was really kind of no big deal, but nobody else really took the time to do it. So there was maybe three of us at the exchange that could trade the stuff on the last day.
What did you do next?
From the MidAm, I went down to New Orleans. C.C. Odom was the chair of the New Orleans Rice and Cotton Exchange. So they reopened that. That was fun. Lost a lot of money getting caught in rice spreads. The commercials let us. There was some guy from the wheat pit from the Board of Trade. I forget his name, but he just bid up rice every day to limit up. And then he got us all to go with him. And the commercials just let us do it for about 2 weeks. And the thing went limit down 3 weeks in a row. And I got caught. That was a lesson. But I had to have a hell of a time in New Orleans. But that was in 81. So then in the beginning of 82, end of 81, beginning of 82, they introduced Eurodollar futures at the CME. And they had this program where on a quarter IMM seat or a quarter gold badge, full CME seat, you could trade the bank CDs and the Eurodollars. And they put us, so I did that. Ronnie Manister had a guy over there who was recruiting us from the MidAm to come over then. So that was my first move to a primary exchange when Eurodollars opened, futures. And they put us in these orange jackets and they called us pumpkins, just to delineate us from the full members, the IMM members or the CME members. And now I really, really found something interesting because although it was a pretty crooked place back then, and which I was not used to. And so I was trading the back month bank CDs because bank CDs was a much bigger volume trade, the 3-month bank CD, than the Eurodollars was. I mean, T-bills was the big trade, but I didn't have the seat to do that. But Eurodollars started to get going, and I figured out how to trade tandems, to trade CD spreads against Eurodollar spreads. And then I got I got an IMM seat, and then I could trade T-bill spreads. So I would trade T-bill spreads against bank CD spreads against Eurodollar spreads. And I did very, very well. And I used to literally be able to stand in the middle of a pit, take no risk, and make a tick here and a tick there. And nobody really knew what I was doing, which was kind of cool. But then I just remember one day, Plaza, everything was Plaza. And then I found out who Plaza was. And I was like, holy shit, that's Salomon Brothers. So who do you like in this one, me or Salomon Brothers? Okay. Those guys are getting a basis point, not 100 of a basis point. They're getting a 32nd basis point edge. And I'm scratching around for $25 basis point edge. So I decided to go to the Board of Trade and I bought a gem seat. I went in the Ginnie Mae pit and traders were way better at the Board of Trade, especially in the bond room. And so I ended up in the grain room in the soybean futures pit. And I was kind of lost. I mean, I remember standing in the middle of and I didn't even know what dime they were open. And then, I had some friends, Tommy Ganeri and Jimmy Prine. And, there was a lot of guys that my dad created a tremendous amount of goodwill over the years. So I ended up eventually in the corn futures pit. And I was up where the Crucidlos were, up by the third option. And my dad was very good friends with George Martin. And George Martin, his sons, Larry Martin, was in the wheat pit, and Bobby Martin was a prolific spreader in the corn futures. And so supposedly, as my dad tells the story, George Martin was the first local in the late 1940s, early 50s that figured out how to do spreads. And it's kind of cool that his two sons became, especially Bobby, prolific spreaders. So I was in the corn futures, and I remember, my arms would hurt, hold them up, quarter bid, quarter bid. But I remember one day it was very interesting. I'm standing in the corn futures pit, and this guy comes over to me, and it's Tom Neal. And Tom Neal was potentially the biggest trader on the whole grain floor, okay, Tenco. And he goes to me, he goes, well, what do you think about the March-May spread? I looked at him like, are you talking to me? I was like 27-year-old kid, okay, and here's one of the most successful guys at the exchange. And I'm like, well, I don't know. It's like, if you really want to know what I think, you probably got a limit position on. And I found out years later from Tom that when he first came to the Board of Trade, he worked for Continental Grain, and he used to run orders to my father. And he told me the story that my dad one day said, listen, stick around here when it gets slow and come over and see me. And my dad explained how all the cash grain boards worked on the old grain floor. And Tom said, your dad was one of the nicest, classiest guys at the exchange. And I'll never forget, how he helped me. And, Tom, his Christmas party was the invite. And he started inviting me to his Christmas party. I was just like, what's going on here? And, I found out years later, and that was the kind of place that the Board of Trade was. It was about family. It was about integrity. It was about our relationships. Still to this day, I'm still involved in different investments with traders. And I'll tell you one thing, traders always make their capital calls, okay? So that word is their bond. There's a lot of truth to that.
When did you first start to make money?
I ended up going back to the Merc for a while. I got into it with my clearinghouse about just how risky the tandem spreads were, because they didn't really understand them. So they were just going off the exchange risk. And so I ended up going back to the MidAm, and I built out and set up an exchange phone, it was called, with Griffin. So the Hanleys were back now in the 80s. And I was spreading beans again. And then they announced that the CFTC was going to release the restriction on commodity option trading that they had put in place, I think back in like 1933. So they were going to open soybean options first. I remember it was Halloween 1984, the day soybean options opened. And, I was in the S&P pit when it opened at the Merc, the futures pit, in the options pit at the CME, S&P options. I didn't really know how to trade options, but I know how to spread. Option trading is just another dimension of spreading. And, I went to New Orleans, try and be in on the ground floor there, started trading soybean options. The first day they were opened at the Board of Trade. And then they went on and they opened later corn options, soybean meal, soybean oil options, wheat options, but soybeans were first. I started to get a hang for it. It was almost like my futures trading background and risk taking, and having been in so many pits was almost more valuable than knowing how to trade options. And I learned really from other guys who had come over from the CBOE how to trade options. And I became like the biggest trader in the pit pretty quickly. And I started to get in trouble at some point there for position limit violations. And, I'd have to put trades in my brother's accounts. I'd have to put trades in other people's accounts. And I think the statute of limitations up. So I think I'm okay with the CFTC now. But I think I honestly hold still to this day the record for position limit violations at the Chicago Board of Trade. I think I broke it 7, 8, 9 times. And finally, the Business Conduct Committee called me in, and John Ruth was the chair of the Business Conduct Committee. And he said to me, he goes, listen, Hanley, I remember he called me by my last name. He goes, I knew your father, you come from a good background, but we are a self-regulated exchange. And if we see you again, you're going to get suspended for 6 months. And I'm like, well, Mr. Ruth, the business accounting committee was like the Supreme Court back then, so it was intimidating. I'm like, I got positions out for 15 months. I mean, I got huge inventory here of option positions. If you suspend me for 6 months, I mean, it's going to be devastating. He's like, we got to do what we got to do. We got to do our job. So I figured out then it was time. I had to clone myself. I had to scale myself. So I started to bring friends into the business and have them clerk for me. And I'd open up accounts for them, get seats for them, and then put them on the seats and back them. And that's how Hanley Group started in 1985. Out of Hanley Group grew Blink Trading, which I started in 1998. We were one of the first electronic trading companies that had a spread engine that could trade across exchanges. So we could spread between the DTB exchange, because it was before it became, it merged with the Sofex exchange, the Swiss exchange, to become Eurex, and the French, the CAC. So we'd spread between DTB and CAC. And there's a guy from Hull Trading, and one of my former clerks, Mike Sekulik, and then Fred Monroe. He was at Apple Computer previously, and we started Blink Trading. And I sold Blink Trading in 2002 to Dan Tierney and Steve Schuler, Getco guys. And I should have tried to merge with them or something, but I'll never forget, they didn't have the money, the $2.5 million to pay me for my, whatever it was, 50% of the company. So they had to pay me off in time payments. And it's a funny story, because Getco went on to be a rival to Citadel in the 2000s. Amazing story what Steve and Dan did at Getco.
How large did Hanley Group get?
The largest Hanley Group ever got was about 100 people in 2009. We just mostly traded options. We were probably the largest agricultural options traders in the world for a good 10 to 15 years, from 1987 to 2002. And what happened was I was blessed with a lot of really, really sharp young kids that came my way. A lot of kids of traders from the grain floor at the Board of Trade. Cashman, Brent Crumfoltz, David Fisher. I mean, just to recall a few. Some of the guys, they weren't happy. They wanted to be more than just partners at Hanley Group. And so they were high-powered guys. They wanted their own firm. So I would lever up my clearinghouse relationships, my memberships, and my capital. And I would start, I started Blink Trading, and I started what came out of Hanley Group Capital, which was my broker-dealer, where I built out a option, our business between the CBOE, the CME, and the IMM pit at the Board of Trade. So my equity option, stock option business, I handed it over to a couple of my young guys, and that became Infinium Capital Management. And Infinium, I think it was 265 people. We traded 24/7 globally, made the leap into electronic trading. Where we really made most of our money was the arbitrage between the floor and upstairs. I probably brought between the different companies, 300-400 people into the business over the years.